good to be back again with you, dear friends. A rather intriguing subject we have for today. Are creationists idiots? Was a question asked by a well-known professor, and I'm going to let our well-known guest, John Mackay, geologist, International Director for Creation Research Australia. Good to have you back again.
Thank you.
Okay, are we idiots? And who said that? Tell us.
Well, you find it's actually a common sentiment that's expressed by the leading and most arrogant evolutionists of the day. You'll get this impression from people like Richard Dawkins, Professor Richard Dawkins. You know, you get books like The Selfish Gene. You get David Attenborough implying that anybody who doesn't believe evolution has got a screw loose up there, right? And so you'll find that this is a very common feeling expressed by the leading evolutionists of the day. And of course the biggest problem they have is that, well, the trouble is Robert, the guy I quoted before, is not an idiot, right?
Nope.
And actually that's a different program, so I forgot all about that. So when you have a look at many of the people who work, say, with creation research, Robert Powell is a state government geologist. Robert Stewart is a oil geologist, right? Men who are provably not idiots, and yet they firmly believe in creation. And then, as I like to point out, so did the first geologists. In fact, geology did not give rise to the theory of evolution because Charles Darwin's biggest opponents were the geologists. Evolutionism did not give rise to science. Science did not grow out of the arrogant evolutionary atheism that is so dominant today. It grew out of a very conservative Christian view of the world, because you have to have a belief that there's law and order in order to be a scientist. So that, number one, these men were not idiots when they founded science. Number two, they were all provably creationists and largely Christian. And number three, they invented a method which has basically worked, a test and apply and recheck and test again sort of method. But it's got a biblical basis. Test everything, says the Bible. Only keep the things that are provably true. So number one, you'll find that the creationist who put the rockets on the moon was not an idiot. Dr. John Johnson, who has designed the guidance system for the space shuttle and works with us when I'm in Seattle, you know, I mean, these guys are simply not idiots, but they are provably creationists. So despite the common belief, it's simply a falsehood. But it sounds good when you sling mud, doesn't it? And stops young people thinking, well, I don't want to join that crowd because they're provably idiots.
Knowing that Richard Dawkins is a professor, a British professor of biology, am I right? This is the word professor.
It really gives status, doesn't it? Yes.
Yeah, but for someone to call another group of people idiots, I mean, we are taught today, okay, to be tolerant. Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter what, to be ultra tolerant. Okay? Is school, is university a place to call anyone idiot?
Well, number one, you'll find
does that help education?
You'll find the philosophy of tolerance is actually intolerant of anybody who has got a fixed position. So therefore our so-called tolerance of modern society is itself a falsehood which has grown out of evolutionary agnosticism. So we shouldn't be surprised the two go together. And yes, you're quite right, it doesn't help education when I label you as an idiot, because you shouldn't be at university if you are, okay? From a Christian perspective, it says call no man a fool. He may simply have the wrong convictions because nobody shared the truth of Jesus Christ with him. But in the case of some of the leading evolutionists, they not only know the truth, they have rejected the truth, and this is the best they can do to cover it up. It's a guilty conscience syndrome, I'm sure. They have to accuse people of being exactly what they're doing. You remember how the Bible says, whoever says in their heart there is no God, what is he?
A fool.
A fool. Now, I actually became a Christian through the writings of a fool. All right? Now, you might find this surprising, but I was reading a science book written by an atheist. You see, I didn't go to church and I was an evolutionist, and this guy had a whole chapter on why there is no God. And I thought, hang on, this is a biology book. What's this religion stuff doing in here? And then he began to argue his reasons as to why there was no God. Now, you don't have to be an ultra bright science student to realise I can prove something exists. I can't prove something doesn't exist, right? So therefore, he was trying to establish an absolute negative. Now, philosophically, that's impossible, right? So by the end of the chapter, I thought to myself, this guy's an idiot. Of course, I didn't say that verbally, but later on, I picked up the book he was poking fun at, which was the Bible. And I read it through, and of course you get to the psalm where it says, whoever says there is no God is a fool. And I thought, yeah, because he's trying to prove something that is impossible to prove. It's easier to prove that God exists because he does, and it's a positive statement. So you will find that the atheist who says this is actually accusing his Christian opponents of the very thing that he's guilty of himself.
I would just encourage you, friends, if you are taxpayers, and probably you are heavy taxpayers, would you just challenge boards of education of, is your taxpayers' money going to people who are just invested probably, are they invested there to call others idiots? Do you send your children to school to be, taught to consider other idiots? I would just leave that as a challenge to you. I have a quote from Professor Dawkins saying the following, quote, evolution has been observed, it just hasn't been observed while it has been happening, quote unquote. Besides being a bright, beautiful English statement that would make any sophist happy for at least a half an hour to chew on, would you just talk about its implications?
Sure. This is actually not as surprising as it seems, because he was being challenged during that interview whether evolution was a theory or was a fact. This is his response, and I'd suggest people, find on the web the PBS interview, it's available, and he spends the next 10 minutes trying to dig himself out of the hole that he just sank himself into, right? Because he's just made the classic non-statement. But then when I was a student, being somebody who trained in geology, I discovered that we geologists were the undertakers of the world. We were into dead things, fossils. So I decided to do genetics and discover living things. And I remember one student putting up their hand and saying, Professor, if evolution is true, how come we can't see it happening? Now let's just check that little bit for a start. Romulus, you've been on this planet for some 40 years, correct?
Yep.
How many things have you seen evolve? Now come on, be honest about it.
None.
In fact, I haven't met anybody who's seen anything evolve, so the professor did not deny this student's statement. Sir, if evolution is true, how come we can't see it happening? Now, the professor said, well, evolution takes such a long time to happen, you wouldn't expect to see it happening. Duh. Yeah, now as a student I thought, yeah, that makes sense. Evolution is happening so slow, I wouldn't expect to see it happening, so when I don't see it happening, that's the evidence that is happening. Hang on, something's wrong here somewhere. You see, you've reached a point where if you can't see something happening, is the reason that you can't see it because it's so slow you wouldn't expect to see it happening, or is it because it's not happening? Now, Richard Dawkins has just sunk himself into a philosophical hole that he can never get out of. What he really should have said is, if we haven't observed evolution while it's been happening, we haven't observed it at all. And if we haven't observed it, therefore the world that we live in is one where apple trees turn into apples, and pineapples turn into pineapples, and bananas turn into bananas, and they produce their own kind, just like the Bible said. So let's take notice of the God who was there, rather than the imaginary non-God that atheists like to boast about.